Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 21st, 1789, finally we are in the 18th century. John Adams is inaugurated as the nation's first vice president 9 days before George Washington takes office. George Washington was the first president, in case you didn't know. I'm joined, as always, by Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Nikki, hello.
Hello, Jody.
And our special guest this episode, historian Alexis Coe. She's done a ton, including an amazing podcast series called Presidents Are People Too. Most recent book is all about George Washington. It's called You Never Forget Your First. Alexis, hello and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I want to start with one sort of small thing, which I just find I love, and I know, Nikki, you love this too when we were researching this, but from the very beginning, Adams was complaining about being vice president and how he has to play second fiddle. I just love this notion that it was baked in right from the beginning that vice presidents felt looked over, passed over, and totally powerless.
I think that John Adams was born complaining. I think he was born feeling somewhat slighted, which worked for him to a certain extent. And they all did, by the way, Washington, Benedict Arnold. It was just somewhere better at controlling it than others. All the founders were wildly ambitious. But from the very beginning, Adams sidelined himself. They were supposed to be this incredible duo, right? They weren't a natural pairing, but it was supposed to please everyone. You have Washington, the Virginian, the military man, and then you have Adams, the New Englander, the attorney, the guy who had been abroad, working on behalf of America while Washington fought on the ground. But it immediately falls apart.
Yeah, I think that wildly ambitious thing, it helps us understand why Adams took it anyway, right? Because he was like, I'm not going to be able to do anything, although he tried. But It could be a stepping stone to the presidency. And I think every vice president has that ambition that puts them into this position that they then disparage the whole time.
It's like the poison pill, it's the most logical path. I think they even recognized it back then, but then it's, you are inherently sidelined. But Alexis, you said something like Adams sidelined himself, because my understanding was they sort of sidelined him, but what do you mean he sidelined himself?
Well, as far as the election, he was never going to be president. Everyone knew that. The presidency was crafted with Washington in mind. The founders went on this letter writing campaign begging him to be president. Madison skipped out on his own family's Christmas in order to go to Mount Vernon to convince Washington. So there was never the idea that anyone but Washington would be president. Adams, again, he was just a nice compliment. So Adams is the vice president, and people already talk about him behind his back. They call him his rotundity. He's not, people respect him. He's so intelligent, but he's not popular. It's begrudging at best. No one really knew what the vice president would do, but immediately Adams walks in and he's like, I've got an agenda. It's very specific, whereas Washington is like, let's survive. What are his policies? It's a question I'm often asked. It's getting through the first 4 years, just maintaining a democracy for a short period of time. But Adams decides that his agenda is very, very narrow, and it's all about titles and all the things that America had done away with and fought against the monarchy in order to never deal with again.
I think that the monarchy thing is really key here, that you did have this contingent within the founding fathers, who, by the way, sound kind of like a bunch of mean girls. I feel a little bad for Adams, but that the trappings of the monarchy, it wasn't that easy to just let it all go because it had defined what leadership looked like for their entire lives.
Yeah.
As much as they wanted to rebel, they were like, but there are parts of it that are a pretty good system. And maybe if we just don't let it, say, fall into corruption and decay and, have power land in a few hands, then we should be good. Some of them were more federalist, like Washington and Hamilton, but Adams, Jefferson, all those guys were like pretty into the monarchy still.
I think we're getting a sense here of how much this was a break, but then whenever you break and you step into uncharted territory, you kind of have to figure out what comes next. And there's all sorts of these examples, big and small, of people just sort of having to figure it out on the fly, including the fact that Adams was inaugurated 9 days before Washington. So you have this 9-day gap where there is a vice president, but not a president. Alexis, is that just like a nice little tidbit, or is there actually something significant about that 9-day gap?
Yes and no. It's significant, obviously, because it strikes us as odd, but they were trying to figure out what was going on. Do we do this on the same day? Does it have to be related? The vice presidency was never supposed to be the center of the story. It's not that he would steal Washington's spotlight. It's that he wouldn't even exist within 100 miles of it. Also, Adams was nearby. He was in Boston, whereas Washington was coming all the way from Virginia on horseback ride, and he had to stop for all these parades because he was the great hero of the revolution now coming to, help America get through its infancy. He called it an infant empire. So there were parades everywhere. Every bridge had big signs. So it took a long time for him to get there. But in general, these sorts of meetings, you never knew when they were going to start. You never knew when they were going to end. You just hoped you got the dates sort of right.
Nikki, this way of picking a vice president, Adams comes in second. He gets the number 2 job. Obviously not how we do it, where it's now hand selected by the nominee and the party. We're living in a moment where there's a bit of a push towards more populist measures around elections. This may be a naive question, but is there any scenario in which we go back to first place gets to be president and second place is vice?
I don't think so, because of precisely what happened when that was the case. You would get the vice president being the person who got the second most votes, and that person could be from a different party. And in fact, Adams when he becomes president, is the only person who has to actually deal with a vice president from a different party. So he has Jefferson as his vice president. And Jefferson and Adams, not only are they not from the same party, they don't even like each other. And they run against each other both in 1796 and in 1800 when Adams loses to him. And you can imagine how untenable of a system it is. Like if Hillary Clinton were president and Donald Trump were vice president or vice versa, that's not a tenable relationship, especially once it becomes clear that if the president passes away, the vice president becomes the president.
Right. Alexis, anything you want to say about George Washington's inauguration? I know you talked a little bit about that, but it happens in 9 days. I don't think we're going to revisit it on this podcast. So this is your chance to just talk a little bit about that moment.
I mean, it took forever. It was just the longest day. He arrived the night before. This is not the most important part, but of course it's sort of dumb, so I remember it and I'm interested in it. They had incredible fireworks. The way that they described them, the entire revolution is sort of like played out in the skies of New York, because that was the original site of the Capitol. And it sounds incredible, party after party. And Washington, as usual, is annoyed at such a thing and just wants to get to work. But meanwhile, Adams is there facilitating everything. He has to announce Washington when he enters Federal Hall. He has to walk him to the balcony at the last minute. The Bible, right? The hand, we always see the incoming president's hand on a Bible. That was just a random last minute thing. And since Washington and so many of the founders were Masons, guy ran out to the nearest masonry and just like grabbed it, came back. Washington put his hand on it. And at the end, nobody knew what to do. So the guy who's holding the Bible like held it up, and Washington's like, do I kiss it? Like, I don't really understand what's going on. And that was pretty much it. He was thrilled when it was over. Martha arrived a few weeks later. The wives were almost never there in the beginning during the inauguration, which is really interesting because, of course, now we think of them being front and center, and then usually they're flanked by children. But that didn't happen in part because it took a while to sort of like move house, and the wives seem to always be doing something, getting things put away, letting out the farms, whatever it was. But just never really happened that way. It was sort of all business. So in some ways it was more professional. But Adams already, things are pretty tense during the inauguration, in no small part because Adams had wanted to call Washington His Highness, and that was like the short version. The full version was His Highness, the President of the United States of America and Protector of the Rights of the Same. Like all the time, that entire mouthful.
Yeah. All right. Well, there's a good example of presidents and vice presidents are people too. And when you get a promotion, sometimes you don't really know what you've gotten yourself into with your new job. So Alexis Coe, thank you as always. And Nicole, thanks to you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. You can find lots more about the show, including how to suggest topics at thisdaypod.com. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Alexis and Nikki will be back next episode for a bit of a lighter topic. We're going to be talking about Howard Stern, yes, that Howard Stern, and his flirtations with becoming New York's governor. Also, I want to mention one thing. Tomorrow is Earth Day. We've gotten a lot of requests to do something around Earth Day. It didn't line up, but thank you for those requests. And a reminder that on social, we are always marking interesting moments every single day. You can find our accounts at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.